Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Happy Hanukkah. This is Zois Hanukkah or Zot Hanukkah, depending on how you pronounce it, but meaning this is Hanukkah, the 8th day of Hanukkah. This is the festival of miracles. The 8th day contains the spirituality and the uplift of all the other days of Hanukkah. And we have the classic teaching that, God made the world in 6 days, rested on the 7th. That's why we all live in this world in 7-day weeks. I mean, think about it. Why 7-day weeks? Could have been 6-day weeks, 8-day weeks, 10-day weeks, 7-day weeks. 7 represents nature, the world as we know it. 8 is beyond. 8 is the infinite. 8 is the realm of miracles. If you need a miracle in your life, if you need a miraculous healing, if you have a situation that requires a miracle, today, special power in this day, ask God for the miracle that you need. Very, very special day, and may everybody receive the revealed miracles that they need. And we as a people, please God, the greatest revealed miracle would be that the war should end and it should end in a lasting and secure peace for Israel. We say Amen. Who's in the house on a Friday? Shandor in the Bronx, Bill in Missouri, Renee in Indiana, Karen in Northern California, Gordo in Scotland, John in Maine, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey. Prayers for the neshama of my brother-in-law, Ben Sion Moshe Ben Natan Halevi. He passed away last night from pancreatic cancer. May the neshama have a great aliyah. Baruch Dynamis, I'm so sorry to hear this news, Sharon, and may you and all the mourners be comforted. And we say Amen. Paula in Chicago, as well as Marjorie saying Shalom. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily sponsored by our own Bela Rubin. To Sal and Nina and our amazing group, wishing you blessings for a sweet, happy, and healthy year. Amen. We could all use those brachas. Bella, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen. And thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. If you're thinking about sponsoring a class, this is a great time. Our annual campaign is still going strong. We really need your help. Creating the app, building the app, which is going to launch very soon. You can see the video. There's a post further down on the Facebook page. And you can learn more about it at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Every dollar is just so meaningful to us. Any amount. It's great to have you participate in our nonprofit and enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. All right, let's get to it. Our daf today is page 43 here in Tractate Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 5. In chapter 4, we left off yesterday, cliffhanger, with a question. As Rabbah is arguing with the sages about this interpretation of what Rabbi Akiva was arguing with Rabbi Eliezer, and this idea that if an ox gores a woman and she miscarries, in addition to the damage to her, does the owner of the ox also owe damages for the dead fetus, for the miscarriage of the fetus that was caused by this accident? Or, first of all, there's a difference. We could have different outcomes if it's an innocuous ox without the history of goring, or a forewarned ox, the muad that has gored before. But there's also this question that the Torah talks about. Two men are fighting with each other, and by accident, one of them collides with this woman and she miscarries. Okay, so then there is compensation for the fetus in that situation. are we going to extend that law from, the force of a person caused that damage, which is always considered forewarned, and which, always results in all, not only damages for the actual physical damage, but the 4 types of indemnity, medical costs, loss of livelihood, etc., and even humiliation. Are we going to extend that kind of liability to this other area of the law, the ox that belongs to a person or not? And so one of the interpretations in this discussion is, well, if she is going to be paid the damages, or if she, let's say she was killed, but there was also, a fetus that miscarried, so who receives the compensation for the fetus? It would seem that her husband is her heir for that, but not necessarily, right? Women come into a marriage with some property. When the marriage ends, either through divorce or her death, the property that she brought with her doesn't go to the husband. That will remain in her family. And so there are certain kinds of assets that are owed to the wife, or that are coming externally, or damages like this that could be paid that would not necessarily go to her husband. They might go to her heirs other than her husband. And that's what they're talking about. So Rav Papa said, the Torah awarded the payment of compensation for miscarried offspring to the husband, even if he is not actually her legal husband, but rather one who, impregnated her through licentious sexual intercourse, right? Remember, according to the Torah, the only permitted sexual intercourse is within marriage, right? By Torah law, sex outside of marriage is prohibited. So if a couple, get pregnant and they're going to have a baby together, but they're not married, so that's considered licentious sexual intercourse. Nevertheless, the man who does, participates in that is the father of the child. So says Rav Papa, in terms of, where she miscarries and loses the fetus, the damages for that are going to go to her husband because he's the father. And even if they're not legally married, they're going to go to the father. And what is the reason? Because the verse states, as the husband, Baal, of the woman shall impose upon him, from Exodus 21:22, indicating that damages are not collected, damages for the loss of the fetus, are not collected by the woman, but by the man who engaged in intercourse with her and impregnating her. Therefore, if they got divorced, the ex-husband receives the payment. So the Gemara asks, why do Rabbah and Rav Nachman explain this baraisa as referring to a divorcee, a divorced woman? They could have answered in accordance with their own opinions, as stated elsewhere in Tractate Bava Basra 124b, that it is referring to payments that are not considered to have been in the woman's possession during her lifetime, right? Like an inheritance that it was owed to her, but she had not yet received it, which her husband does not inherit. Let us establish this baraisa according to Rabbah as referring to a case where they collected money for the damage and pain, and according to Rav Nachman, where they collected land, as with regard to the right of a firstborn to receive a double portion of the inheritance of his father, he receives a double portion only of the property possessed by his father, but not of the property that is due to him, that is owed to him, but that he does not yet possess. In a case where money was owed to the father, Rabbah says if the heirs collected the debt from land, the firstborn has the right to a double portion, since it is considered property that was already in the father's possession. But if they collected money as opposed to land, he does not have a double portion, as it is considered property that was owed to the father. And Rav Nachman says if they collected money, the oldest does have a double portion, and if they collected land, he does not have a double portion. And the Gemara answers that statement applies according to the residents of the West, meaning the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to the community in Babylonia. And this is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, the majority, who limit the rights of a firstborn to his father's property to the extent that they hold he does not receive a double portion of any appreciation in the property occurring after his father's death. And by contrast, when they state that this baraisa here relates to a divorced woman, it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, that the firstborn receives a double portion even in the appreciation of the property occurring after the father's death. According to this opinion, clearly everything due to the father is considered to be in his possession, whether he receives his compensation in money or land. Why are we talking about this? Because the same applies to a husband who inherits the rights to inherit compensation for damage and pain that were inflicted on his wife. If she's owed damages and she died, the husband inherits those damages. And that is why Rabbah and Rav Nachman had to interpret this baraisa as relating to a divorced woman, where the husband has no rights to those damages because she's no longer his wife. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, with regard to an ox that killed a Canaanite slave. Now we're back to the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, with regard to an ox that killed a Canaanite slave unintentionally, the owner is exempt from paying the fine of 30 shekels, which the Torah stipulates is owed to the owner of a Canaanite slave if his slave is killed by a goring ox. As it is stated, Exodus 21:32, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Now, if the ox shall be stoned, that tells you that it was not an accident, right? That the ox gored the slave with intent to hurt the slave and killed him. Right? And that's why anytime an ox kills a person, when it's not accidental or due to circumstances beyond the ox's control, the ox is stoned, right? And that's the verse that we keep coming back to, that when an ox kills a person, the ox is stoned, and you cannot eat that ox, even if it was shechted, if it was slaughtered in a proper manner before the court's verdict was carried out that it should be stoned. Still, you cannot eat it, and in fact, you cannot make any use of it. You cannot benefit from the carcass of this ox that killed a person. Now, the Torah stipulates that if it kills a slave, a Canaanite slave, the ox is still stoned, but the owner of the ox does not pay the ransom that we're talking about, nor damages based on the value of the slave, but rather it's a stipulated amount, these 30 shekels of silver. And it is derived from the verse that the liability to pay 30 shekels is dependent on the stoning of the ox. So whenever the ox is liable to be killed by stoning, the owner pays 30 shekels as compensation for the death of the Canaanite slave. But if the ox is not liable to be killed by stoning, for example, if it killed unintentionally, then the owner does not pay the 30 shekel fine. Which is interesting because that if the 30 shekel fine is taken off the table, then the owner of the ox might end up having to pay more. Because once the 30 shekel fine doesn't apply, then depending on whether he was negligent or something, where we could find a case where the ox was not trying to cause damage, but the fact that the ox was where it was due to the negligence of the owner might result in the owner of the ox having to pay a lot more money. Now, similarly, Rabbah says, with regard to an ox that killed a free man unintentionally, its owner is exempt from paying the ransom. Right, now remember, we're distinguishing the ransom from the damages. The damages is to make the injured party whole for the physical damage that was sustained. The ransom is a separate amount based on the valuation of the owner of the ox that he has to pay to the family, the heirs of the one who was killed. And this serves, as we've said repeatedly, although not according to every opinion, it serves as an atonement, right? That one who owns an ox that killed another person, which in a manner that didn't rise to the level of that the owner of the ox would be guilty, you'll be subject to a death penalty, then he owes the ransom because he's not subject to a death penalty in an earthly court, but he bears moral responsibility, and until he pays that ransom, he is subject to divine punishment. So it's something that the owner of the ox needs to do, is to pay that ransom. And ransom, it's not the best translation, but the word is kofer. Okay, so similarly, Rabbah says, with regard to an ox that killed a free man unintentionally, its owner is exempt from paying the kofer. As it is stated, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death, if a ransom is laid on him. And this indicates that whenever the ox is liable to be killed by stoning, because the ox was trying to hurt a person and ended up killing him, then the owner pays ransom. And if the ox is not liable to be killed by stoning, because it was accidental or circumstances beyond the ox's control, then the owner does not pay the kofer. So Abaye raised an objection to Rabbah's statement from a Mishnah. If a person admits, my ox killed so-and-so, or my ox killed the ox of so-and-so. So this owner pays based on his own admission for the physical damage, the actual loss that his ox caused. Now this cannot be referring to the payment of a fine, because one who admits that he's liable to pay damages is exempt from paying a fine. A fine is different than damages, and the kofer is different than the fine. Those are three different kinds of payments. This cannot be referring to the payment of a fine, as a person who admits his responsibility for an act incurring a fine is exempt from paying the fine. So clearly it must be referring to a payment for which one can render himself liable through admission. So what? Is it not referring to the payment of the ransom, the kofer? If so, this proves that payment of ransom is not dependent on whether the ox is liable to be killed by stoning, as the ox cannot be killed based on the owner's admission alone. And the Gemara answers no. It is referring to payment of the monetary value of the victim. That's the damages. Although he is not liable to pay the kofer, as the ox is not killed, nevertheless, since by his own admission his ox killed the person, he is liable to pay the value of the person. So Abaye challenged this answer. If it is referring to the value of the victim, say that the latter clause of our Mishnah, if a person admits, my ox killed the Canaanite slave of so-and-so, he does not pay based on his own admission. And if, as you claim, the Mishnah is referring to the value of the victim, not to the 30 shekel fine, why should he not pay? And Rabbah said to Abaye, I could have answered you by saying that the former clause, which discusses an ox killing a free man, is referring to the value of the victim. And the latter clause, which relates to an ox that gored a slave, is referring to payment of the 30 shekel fine. But I will not answer you with a forced answer. Instead, I will answer as follows. Both this clause and that clause refer to the value of the victim. Now we're on 43b, but there is a distinction between the two cases. With regard to an ox killing a free man, there is a scenario where the owner pays the kofer based on his own admission. And what are the circumstances? If witnesses came and testified that the ox killed a free man and is therefore liable to be killed by stoning, but they did not know whether it was a tam, an innocuous ox, or a forewarned, a muad ox, and its owner said that it was a muad. So in this case, the owner pays the ransom based on his own admission, pays the kofer based on his own admission, since the ox is liable to be killed. And the kofer is for atonement and does not constitute a fine. Therefore, even when there are no witnesses and the ox is therefore not liable to be killed by stoning for killing a person, nevertheless, the owner at least pays the monetary value of the victim based on his own admission. By contrast, with regard to an ox killing a slave, where there is a scenario where one does not pay the fine of 30 shekels based on his own admission. And what are the circumstances where one would be liable to pay this fine due to his own admission? If witnesses came and testified that the ox killed a slave, but they did not know whether it was a tam or a muad, and the owner said that it was a muad. So in this case, even though the ox is liable to be killed, the owner does not pay the fine based on his own admission due to the principle that one does not pay a fine based on his own admission. Therefore, in a case where there are no witnesses, he does not even pay the value of the victim based on his own admission. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak raises an objection from a baraisa that states a principle. In any scenario where a person is liable for his ox killing a free man, he is liable for his ox killing a Canaanite slave, whether with regard to liability to pay the kofer or with regard to the ox being put to death. And the wording of the brisa is unclear. Is there a kofer to be paid in the case of a slave? The kofer is paid only for killing a free man. Rather, is it not referring to the payment of the value of the victim? And this poses a difficulty for Rabba's opinion that one is not liable to pay the value of the victim for admitting to his ox's killing of a slave. Now, there are those who say that Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, raised the objection and he resolved it. And there are those who say that it was Rabbah who said to him in response that this is what the Bryce is teaching. In any scenario where a person is liable to pay the kofer for his ox killing a free man, for example, where it gored intentionally based on the testimony of witnesses, he is liable to pay a fine for his ox killing a slave. And in any scenario where one is liable to pay the value of the victim for his ox killing a free man, for example, where it gored unintentionally, based on the testimony of witnesses, for a slave too, one is liable to pay the value, namely, where it gored unintentionally and based on the testimony of witnesses. So accordingly, one does not pay the value of a slave based on his own admission, although he does pay the value of a free man if he admits that his ox killed him. So Rava said to Rabbah, if that is so, that one is liable to pay the value of the victim in cases where he is exempt from paying the kofer, then if a person if a person burns another to death unintentionally with his fire, and the proof is based on the testimony of witnesses, he should likewise at least pay the value of the victim. Now we're bringing in a fire, right? So remember when we started this tractate, there were 4 basic types of damage, and all other kinds of damage in the world are going to flow from these 4 sort of primary categories, right? One is your ox. Now the ox sort of can be divided into whether your ox gored, right? Your dangerous ox caused damage that way, or your ox trampled, where the ox wasn't trying to do anything wrong, it was just led in a place where it walked over stuff and did damage, or your ox ate, right? It ate somebody else's produce, the ox was just doing what it normally does. But the goring ox is what we're generally talking about now. And that was distinguished from a pit, a hole that you dug in the public domain and you left a hazard there and it caused damage to people when they fell in. And that's as opposed to fire. If you started a fire, and maybe it was a legitimate fire for you to have in the place where you started the fire, but you didn't control it properly, and now the fire spread. And obviously a fire can cause tremendous damage, tremendous harm. I mean, we live in LA, you may have heard, every year, it's terrible, right? Fires get out of control, brush fires, by the sides of the freeways, approaching communities and neighborhoods, houses burn up. A fire can do enormous damage because the nature of a fire is to be on the move. So now that we're going to compare, first of all, there's your ox, like you own the ox, you're responsible for safeguarding the ox. Now, within the category of the ox that gores, we're distinguishing between whether it has a history of goring or not, right? So that's the muad versus the tam. But we're also distinguishing between where the ox actually uses its horns intentionally, right? It wants to hurt the animal or person that is in front of it, as opposed to unintentional, right? If your ox was just being led down a crowded street and a bee stung it and the ox just jumped, and when it did that, its horn sort of went to the side and hurt someone. Now it hurt with its horns, but that's not an intentional goring by the ox, and that's distinguished from where the ox just took offense, at a person and charged and hurt him with his horns. Now, if you set a fire, let's say you're burning leaves in your yard, right? People used to do that, and that fire gets out of control and burns down the neighbor's house, God forbid, and then, and people were in the house and they got hurt. Okay, so that was not an intentional, you didn't intend to hurt your neighbor, to burn his house, to hurt people there. but you did start the fire intentionally. And that's going to be distinguished perhaps from, whatever, you dropped a lighter and somehow it started a fire. You never actually started a fire that got out of control. You didn't, one case is you did mean to start a fire, but it got out of control. That's not what you intended. And that's distinguished from where you didn't even mean to start a fire. It was completely accidental and circumstances beyond your control. So these are all different variables that we're taking into account as we assess liability and damage. So now we're going to start to compare the unintentional goring of a person's ox with the unintentional harm that might result from a person's fire. And let's see what he says. Where am I? Where's the fire? I lost my place. Hold on a second. I thought I was over here. Yeah, so the Gemara asks, and from where, wait. Yes, okay. Okay, here we go. So Rava said to Rava, if that is so, that one is liable to pay the value of the victim, right? So first, they're also arguing that when you owe the kofer, right, if you're going to pay that ransom that's going to act as an atonement for you as the owner of an ox that ended up killing a person, what is the value of that kofer? How do we measure it, right? And Rava and Rabba were arguing. One says that it's based on the value of the person who died, and the other one said it's based on the value of the owner himself. The value of a person, what does that mean? People are priceless, but in the ancient world, they would measure this by the price you would fetch if you were sold in the slave market. So are we going to say it's the value of the victim or the value of the owner of the ox? And it seems like it's actually a better argument, the owner of the ox, because that money is being given as an atonement for himself, that he is subject to divine punishment until he pays it. So Rava said to Rava, if that is so, that one is liable to pay the value of the victim, in cases where he is exempt from paying the kofer, so now we're talking about damages are going to be owed even where the kofer is not owed, then if a person burns another to death unintentionally with his fire, and the proof is based on the testimony of witnesses, he should likewise at least pay the value of the victim. And the Gemara asks, and from where does Rava know that he does not pay the value of the victim if he started the fire unintentionally? If we say that it is from what we learned in a Mishna, on page 61b of this tractate, if one ignites a heap of grain, and there was a goat bound to an item that was adjacent to the heap of grain, and there was also a slave adjacent to it, but the slave was not bound, and the goat and the slave were burned together with the heap of grain, then the one who started the fire is liable to pay for the heap of grain that he destroyed and for the goat, because the goat was bound and couldn't get away. The slave ended up getting killed, but he's not liable for the slave. Why? Because the slave is a human who has independent agency. The slave could have got up and left. For whatever reason, the slave stayed, and that's why he got hurt. And that's distinguished from the goat because a human could leave, and he didn't. If the slave was bound to that item the same way that the goat was, in such a way that he was unable to flee from the fire, and the goat was adjacent to it, and they were burned with it, then he is exempt from liability. Why would he be exempt from liability if his fire burned a heap of grain and the slave couldn't get away? Like, why would he be exempt from liability? Because he's guilty of murder. That's why. He's subject to a much bigger punishment than liability for paying, for the loss of life of the slave. So apparently there is no liability even if he unintentionally burned the slave to death. So it's unintentional, so you can't say that there's a death penalty. So why would he not be liable where the slave couldn't get away? And the answer is because we have this odd wrinkle in the law that if he did it intentionally, it's murder. And that's why he's not subject to, the financial liability, because he is subject to the death penalty. Then, even if he does it unintentionally, also the financial liability doesn't apply, because if it were intentional, there would be a death penalty case. Now, the Gemara comments, if this is Rava's, and not everybody holds by that, by the way. So the Gemara comments, if this is Rava's source, there is no proof from here. Didn't Reish Lakish say that the Mishnah is referring to a case where he ignited the body of the slave directly, in which case he is exempt from paying damages because he receives the greater punishment of the death penalty? If he burned a person on purpose, yeah, he committed murder. Since he is liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment for killing the slave, and there is no distinction between slaves and freemen for the crime of murder, therefore, this does not serve as proof that one is not liable to pay the value of a fire victim. And if Rava's proof is rather from that which is taught in a Baraisa on page 10, that the stringency that applies to fire as opposed to the pit is that one responsible for fire is considered forewarned with regard to it consuming both something that is fitting for it and something that is not fitting for it, i.e. both flammable and non-flammable items. In other words, a fire obviously will spread and burn things that are flammable. But a fire can also damage things that are not flammable but were near the fire. So rather than catching fire, they melted or were scorched or were otherwise damaged, even though they didn't burn up. And you're still liable for that. So this is not so with regard to the pit, as damages are not paid for everything that can be damaged by a pit. But the Baraisa does not teach that with regard to fire, one is liable to pay the value of the victim even if the fire was ignited unintentionally. And this is not so with regard to pit. And this would seem to support Rava's opinion that one is not liable to pay the value of an unintentional victim of fire. So the Gemara comments, if this is Rava's source, there is no proof from here. Perhaps the Baraisa taught one distinction and omitted another. It simply did not enumerate all the differences. Rather, Rava's statement should not be understood as an objection to Rava's opinion, as Rava himself had a dilemma with regard to the matter. If a person burns another to death unintentionally with his fire, does he pay the value of the victim or not? And the Gemara elaborates on the question. Do we say that it is specifically with regard to death caused by one's ox, where if it was done intentionally, he pays the kofer as an atonement for himself? That's in addition to the damages for the person, right? And where it was done unintentionally, he pays the victim's monetary value instead. But with regard to death caused by his fire, where even if it was done intentionally, he doesn't pay kofer, because kofer is tied specifically to an ox. It's not tied to fire. The Torah doesn't talk about kofer when the instrument of danger was a fire. So if it was done unintentionally, he does not pay the value either. Or perhaps, since with regard to the case where the ox gored unintentionally, although there is no liability to pay the kofer, nevertheless, he at least pays the value of the victim. And one should say that with regard to his fire also, even though in a case where it was done intentionally, he does not pay kofer, when it was done unintentionally, he should pay the value of the victim in any event. So the Gemara concludes, and we do not know the solution to this dilemma, which shall stand unresolved. Teku. So, with regard to Rabba's statement that for an ox that killed a person unintentionally, one is exempt from paying the kofer, the Gemara relates that when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he reported that Rabbi Yochanan says, it would have been sufficient for the verse to state a kofer is laid on him. What is the meaning when the verse states, if a kofer is laid on him, Exodus 21:30, it is to include liability to pay the kofer in a case where the ox killed unintentionally, just as one is liable to pay the kofer when it killed intentionally. This is in contrast to Rabba's opinion, and it is in fact the halacha, the law. Now Abaye said to Rav Dimi, if Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation is so, it should be implemented with regard to the fine for a Canaanite slave as well. And it would have been sufficient for the verse to state, the ox gores a slave or a maidservant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver. So what is the meaning when the verse states, if the ox gores a slave? it is to include liability in a case where the ox killed a Canaanite slave unintentionally, just as when the ox killed a slave intentionally. And if you would say that indeed this is the law, but doesn't Reish Lakish say that for an ox that killed a slave unintentionally, its owner is exempt from paying the 30 shekel fine? So Rav Dimi said to Abaye, are you settling the statement of one man against the statement of another man? It could be that although Reish Lakish maintains that he is exempt, Rabbi Yochanan holds that he is liable. And that was a basic disagreement between them. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. So when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he confirmed that this is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, as he says that it would have been sufficient for the verse to state the ox gores a slave. What is the meaning when the verse states if the ox gores a slave? It is to include liability in a case where the ox killed a slave unintentionally, just as when it killed a slave intentionally. You owe the fine either way. So the Gemara suggests, and according to Reish Lakish, let us say similarly that from the fact that he does not interpret the difference between the terms slave and if a slave to derive an additional law, it may be inferred that he does not interpret the difference between the terms kofer and if a kofer either, and holds that a kofer is not paid if the incident was unintentional. And the sages said, no, this is not a valid comparison. Although Reish Lakish does not interpret the difference between the terms a slave and if a slave, he does interpret the difference between the terms ransom and if a ransom. And what is different between the two verses? The terms a slave and if a slave were not written where the liability for payment is stated, but rather in the presentation of the case, if the ox gores a slave. Therefore, the use of the word if is warranted. By contrast, the terms a kofer and if a kofer are written where the liability for payment is stated, where it would have been sufficient for the verse to state a kofer is laid on him. Therefore, the superfluous word if lends itself to interpretation to include liability to pay the kofer, even in a case where the killing was unintentional. That's where we're going to stop. And we'll pick it up, God willing, tomorrow night. Shabbos is ending early these days, and the last few weeks I've been able to get on the air by about 7:30, and maybe Pacific, and maybe even a little earlier tomorrow would be good. Okay, I've got 3 questions. Bill says, now I'm behind a couple of days. Why is the woman... No, she's not liable. The question is whether the owner of the ox is liable when her baby miscarries, caused by the ox, and the original case was 2 men are fighting and one of them injures the woman by mistake and she miscarries, right? So these men are liable to pay for that. The woman's never liable. So I just maybe I was speaking not unclearly, but right. So she's not liable. Joseph, what was a ransom? What was the kofer paid from? Great question, right? So if we're talking about an unintentional goring, or even intentional, but from a tam, right? From an innocuous ox. So then you can only go, for damages to the body of the ox. But the kofer is not damages. So when there's a kofer to be paid, you can go to the property of the owner of the ox. If he has no property, that's a separate question. But as opposed to damages in the case of the innocuous ox, where the injured party only has recourse to the body of the ox, when we're talking about the kofer, that's like the case of the muad, the forewarned ox, where we can go to the property of the owner of the ox, other property that he has. And finally, Joe, is there a discernment regarding the goring of a man who has mistreated or tormented the ox or other animal? Yes, the animal intended to do it, but would there be mitigating circumstances regarding it being labeled or facing death? Such a good question, Joe. It seems to me like at the end of the day, we're talking about some kind of a reasonableness standard, right? In other words, if you haven't, let's say you have an ox that is a tom. It's an innocuous ox, has no history of goring. And it wouldn't have gored in this situation, except that some, wiseacre got in the ox's face and started, teasing the ox for whatever, cruel reason. And the ox finally got fed up and gored that guy, right? Or even, and truthfully, even if it was a muad, right? So it has the history of goring, but the circumstances here are different than circumstances in the past, right? In the past, it gored because whatever, and then let's say the owner trained it not to do that. He did a good job. And he safeguarded the ox properly. But now you get somebody who gets in the ox's face and does something which is outside of what is normal and reasonable in society and is cruel to the ox or teases the ox. So it seems to me like you're making a really strong case that now we're talking about not an ox that gores intentionally and it should be stoned and put to death, but rather an ox that gored due to circumstances beyond its control, because it's not normal for a human to inflict this kind of cruelty and teasing on the ox, and the ox was just, it's just an animal doing what an animal does in that situation, not so different what a human would do, right? Where it was being tormented. I think that would have to be taken into account when the judges are evaluating the case. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow evening after Shabbos ends, approximately 7 to 7:30 p.m. Pacific. May we all experience revealed miracles on this, the 8th day of Hanukkah, Zois Hanukkah. May we all hear great news. May the war be over in a manner that spares all innocent lives and achieves a lasting and secure peace. May we enter Shabbos and the peace of Shabbos may come upon all of us for good. And man, we could all just use some good news these days, couldn't we?